which is a follow-up from the book that the excitement was all in. We all took home and read. I must admit it did improve my sleeping patterns. So funding review of flood management and drainage, and I'll hand over to Janine to get us underway and introductions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you've noted, this is really the deep dive opportunity after the concept of the review was introduced to you a couple of weeks ago. So we've got the team in the room, all in the room today, so really good to have them here today. Really is your opportunity to provide feedback on this draft report. This will form the basis for the next steps in the project for the next financial year, including, probably of key importance, some of the principles that we're looking to get your feedback on today. But we'll hand straight down to the team to get us underway.
And just before you do, just for your information, we do have Councillors Hodge and Cookson online as well. So they are in the room as such. All yours. Oh, you can.
Some of us may have fed back in. So has that already been given to somebody or incorporated?
It was received.
Thank you. Received.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. We'll start off with just a brief introduction from the team, and then we'll launch into it. So good afternoon, my name's Peter Cochran. I'm with Tonkin and Taylor, and we're part of the group that provided this draft report for you. At the earlier council workshop, I was online from Christchurch, but I've managed to make it up here today to be in person. I will hand you over to my left to David Hall to introduce himself and his role.
I'm David Hall. We met a couple of weeks ago, and so my focus has been funding and financing instruments and the different mechanisms by which we might explore more diverse forms of funding and financing for flood protection and drainage.
And I'll hand you over to Kent. He'll introduce himself and then we'll probably kick into it.
Good afternoon all, Mr. Chair, members. Thank you for taking the time for this session. We really appreciate that, things are pretty busy, so we appreciate you taking this length of time to work through what we think are sort of relatively important issues. As we introduced the paper a couple of weeks back, we hope you found it an exciting read. We're gratified that it has helped with sleeping patterns. That's a wonderful thing. So what we thought we'd do is just touch on, actually, if we go to the first slide, that would be great. So what we're going to do in this workshop, we're going to discuss the paper to the degree that you wish to discuss it. If you think this is a thing of unparalleled joy and that there is nothing further to be said on the subject, then this can be a very short workshop indeed. On the other hand, you can drill into it at whatever level of detail you think is appropriate. We're very interested in your feedback. We're interested in your insights and your perspectives. So really, as we work through the paper, please feel free to share your thoughts. Obviously, this is a pretty essential thing that we're trying to do because Project Watershed was last done about 20 years ago. It was a very, very good structure for its day and was probably at the leading edge of what was happening nationally. But of course, a lot has changed in the world since. So what we're doing is obviously assessing where the costs and benefits of flood protection and land drainage occur and how we equitably fund those over the long haul. Now, since we put the paper on the table a couple of weeks ago, there has actually been a fair bit occur. So just at the outset, we wanted to bring you up to date with a couple of relatively major developments. That's around the Karakia Plains Adaptation Plan and Te Uru Kahika's progress on the national business case. So if we can talk about the second of those first, which is, as we said at the time, Te Uru Kahika is engaged in developing a national business case for co-investment between the Crown and regional councils. In the current tranche of funding, Waikato Regional Council has about $18.25 million as a request going into this year's budget. And so hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we should know the outcome of that. The purpose of the business case that we're putting up is to entrench that 60-40 split, because probably, as you may be aware, we've been getting the 60-40 split for some defined projects, but we've had to go cap in hand at every budget cycle. So it doesn't have any continuity of funding. So that's what this new business case is intending to do. The business case is not only being taken to the government, but is being taken out to the other political parties as well, because what we're trying to achieve here is the long-term consensus, so that it doesn't change every time there's a change in government, because we need certainty in the sector. For the first time, we are proposing that the funding split not only applies to CapEx, but also to OpEx. So that basically means that it's not only the construction or the maintenance of new or existing schemes, but the operational costs associated with them. So that's the thing of saying, well, it's all very well if we're putting in a new floodgate or upgrading a pump station, but that work of removing willows or dredging a channel or anything similar is just as important in terms of the maintenance of the flood scheme and the operation of the infrastructure. So that's the big change from the previous business cases, is we're now advocating for a funding split for OpEx. So this business case is being worked on at the moment, due to complete and be presented around about July. So for everyone who has political influence in the room, which I assume is everybody at the national level, your advocacy in support of that equitable split between central government and regional would be very much appreciated. And so the business case will circulate around about July, and you'll get a chance to take a look at that. Okay, any questions on that before we go any further? Next thing is the Karakia Plains Adaptation Plan. Since the last meeting, quite a lot of work has been done with that project team to effectively figure out how we link these two pieces of work together. And as you're aware, some very good work has been going on in terms of the flood modelling and the adaptation that's available. What we're now talking about doing is taking the output from this work and linking it directly into the modelling that HPAP is doing. And the purpose of that is so that the costs and benefits and what the possible options might look like over the long term can now be assessed as part of that adaptation planning. From the point of view of the HPAP, they get much more tangible results out more quickly. From the point of view of this project, the funding review, we get some acceleration of the work, and we avoid the duplication of having to go and do that modelling ourselves. So this is a way of just linking the two pieces of work together. It creates synergies, it lowers costs, and gets us there a bit quicker. Now, we're still working through what the approach might look like, but everything going according to plan. That means we might get some actual numbers in the Lower Hauraki out by round about Christmas, we think.
Just a brief question. There has been work done on the Kaiawa coast and detailed modelling, and I think it came in at 16 million or 60 million. Do you remember the figure? It was a substantial amount of money, and this is obviously Hauraki's much bigger than this. So you're looking at quite large sums. It did have various options that were available.
I'm not entirely sure what came out of the Kaiawa adaptation plan. I think that the benefit that we're seeing out of Karakia is both the degree of detail that both the flood modelling and the adaptation discussions have got to, the level of, as we understand it, buy-in and acceptance of the current state in terms of what it looks like for them. It's aligning with them. I think that gives us an opportunity maybe to leapfrog some of the work that we were looking at doing at phase 2 and advancing that to almost to a degree where we could look at a draft funding and financing policy on how it might look like rolling out for Karakia. That would be really insightful.
So have you seen the funding model and the costs for?
I haven't seen the cost for Kaiawa.
Okay, I'll get that to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Look, I think, Ben, you've got to keep it in context. The Whakamutunga one was 2150. timeframes and went right up to potential relocation. So you know, I think it's a step-by-step stage, very similar to what they've gone through, but it will come down to what's acceptable to the community and where they want to land and how far they want to go. So I think I don't know how much benefit it would be for them to see the Kaiawa one, but
I mean, it's been done, like, it'd be useful for them to have that.
I think for me, being involved in that process, it's more beneficial to understand the process that went through the community and the timeframes it took to actually get to a plan that is aspirational, has a number of outcomes, and there's a number of trigger points that will take that community on that journey. Yeah, thanks, Ken.
Okay, so everyone's reasonably happy at this point. What we thought we might do is leaf into the document. Current document is about the proof of concept. So in other words, if we go down this track, how will it work? How will we pull it together? Where will the data come from? And how will that be explained to people? But the intent is to link flood events and drainage to wider economic and social impacts. So the report explains, and I think, look, in a highly readable, totally engaging way, how we get from floods to dollars, and shows really how the moving parts go together. And we hope it was at least somewhat readable. The key thing is, of course, that this hasn't been developed in the GIS systems yet. That's the next stage. That's what we're working on with the Karakia Plains project. So this is about the theory, not the practice. And we completely understand that as a result, you know, we're kind of waving our hands around and talking about concepts in a document, and that's not always the easiest way to see it. So please bear with us through this phase of things. Okay. So the document itself is obviously in 4 parts. The first of those is the document introduction, and that's really intended for the more public audiences, and we didn't really want to go anywhere near, well, unless anyone's got some immediate questions on the back of that, we thought we would head straight to the second section, which commences on page 14, which is about the opportunities and challenges. Third section is then about analysis and valuation. Fourth section is about equity and funding.
Just for councillors' information, if you did want the book in front of you, there's a pile of them over there on the desk where you walk in. So those that haven't brought their copies with them, which is all 4 of you.
Okay, so
And yeah, just in terms of feedback, we got very useful feedback from Councillor Smith. We haven't had the opportunity to incorporate this in the version that you're seeing. So.
Yeah, so essentially the version we're working through is the version we sent you, so that there's no disparities between what you're seeing in front of you and what you've read earlier. So what we propose to do, and we're just checking in on this, is essentially to whiz through the pages that are pretty much the known knowns, the things that you already know, because remember, this document is partly written for a more public audience, the people who may not necessarily know how the machinery of the council works, what its responsibilities are, you know, all of those important things. So directing you to page 16 and 17, this is very much well, here is the legislative framework and our asset management hierarchy and, you know, all of those entirely interesting things. If we go over to pages 18 and 19, we're talking about the assets. Again, this will be well-known territory to you folk. And really underlining the fact that we are talking about $1.22 billion worth of assets. So this is a very significant investment, and one that we put it on this page because it's largely invisible to most New Zealanders. Simply don't realise the extent of flood management and drainage.
It's current only at 2022, so does it really reflect what it is now? I know you've got to have a baseline, but...
Yep. So there's always more than one way to value assets. Of course, this depends on council asset valuation policies, things like that. Are we valuing it on the historic value, its replacement value, current book value? You know, there's a bunch of different frameworks.
And I accept it highlights the escalating exponentially valuations. So, yeah.
Yeah, and those are largely brought about by the replacement cost accelerating.
So on page 21, which I think you're at, my colleague Angela asked me this morning, investment and flood management, heading at the top of the page, hyphen types of, she asked me to explain what that statement actually means. So I thought if she couldn't understand it, and I didn't really explain it well to her.
Then it means it's badly worded, and I apologise unreservedly. Yes, no.
That's the only thing that I hadn't highlighted that I had already indicated.
Yeah.
So.
Look, one of the things about these documents, probably as you know, is that they get big and complex, and you look at them too long. And having a fresh pair of eyes on this stuff really helps a lot. Councillor, your earlier feedback, for instance, was very good because it highlights areas that, you know. So anyone who spots a typo, there are chocolate fish involved.
Well, I think I'm in for about 3 or 4.
Yeah, the boxes on the courier already. Yeah.
Yeah, diet's gone. Yeah.
Page 22. This is really the heart of really what it amounts to the core of why we need to look at the funding. First is the requirement to sustain the level of service. And the second is that community and business expectations are changing, page 23. So obviously infrastructure was designed and built with a certain level of service in mind, and that's increasingly being challenged on a bunch of different fronts, not least of which is changing weather patterns and also changing patterns of land use. So stop banks that were successfully engineered 60 years ago to protect relatively low value farmland are now protecting much higher value assets. So the level of service, both in terms of what it physically has to achieve from an engineering perspective, but also what the community and business expectations are about levels of protection, those things are changing, and those are the big drivers. If we go then over the page, where that takes us is that there are a range of forward projections. And as you can see from the graph on page 25, you can see the need for ongoing capital investment. And those investments are fairly significant. And that is the heart of the challenge. So due to more pressure on the infrastructure, both from the river side, but also from the human side, we need to spend considerably more in the decades ahead. And that's not really, there's no sort of slackening of that demand.
Yeah, Gary, we'll just pause there.
It's an interesting graph when you look at your CapEx and your OpEx, and I suppose you can probably just embellish it a little bit more because, you know, I would have thought that there's hardly any OpEx in a stop bank, you know, and so, you know, question is why are these overheads, which I'd see OpEx in, why are they going up faster than CapEx or anything else? You know, it just seems to be something out of whack there.
That's a really good question, and the answer is a little bit subtle. So obviously there is OpEx associated with drainage and flood protection. So that's even down to the things like, you know, the power bills for the pumping stations and all of that sort of stuff, and clearing out of waterways, or, you know, just that general maintenance. The thing that turns up in the OpEx line, though, is the depreciation. So depreciation on the assets needs to be funded. The only place it can be funded from is OpEx. And effectively, as the value of our assets goes up, because we have invested more, then the depreciation expense goes up. Right? And so that, along with any interest costs, what other contributors to the increasing OpEx that you see primarily.
So thank you, but I think it still plays in something around the overheads where, you know, I'd love to know what it costs to build, say, a 2-metre high stop bank 30 years ago or 20 years ago, and what it costs to build a 2-metre high stop bank today, you know, and has that outstripped the price of inflation, and has the has the management around it, so the overheads on that outstrip the pace of the actual construction. So, once again, it's we're looking at, where is the real cost lying? So, why is construction, say, outstripping the CPI? It just seems to be something still not in balance there.
Thankfully, we have one of the most skilled senior flood management engineers in the room today, in the form of Mr. Cochrane, who will be able to talk to that exact issue.
I feel like I've just been thrown under the bus, councillor. Look, I think there are a number of things that come to play in here, and probably for us, the easy discussion is that we're not getting into the reasons why the OPEX and the CAPEX are what they are in terms of council's budget and their long term, or what they think their expenditure is on their long term infrastructure strategy. We're looking at ways in which that can be funded and models to look at that funding. Just sort of taking a step back, and certainly, when I had a look at this graph, which is on page 25, one of the things that became evident to us in the work that we have done for Te Uru Kahika is that a lot of councils, both their LTPs and long-term infrastructure strategies, are really a balance between what they believe that they need to achieve, but also what the community is willing and able to afford. And I think both in terms of before the deluge, both versions, we ended up with quite a significant delta in terms of what we thought was needed at a national level versus the aggregate of where all the regional councils had got to, and unitary authorities, where they'd got to in terms of what they thought their funding was. And I think that sort of struck me was that there's an ongoing need to be able to show good governance at a council level, being able to be responsive in terms of reducing rates burden on the ratepayers. And I think that delta exists, and it's started to grow over time as well. So I think this is very much, if you look at this at a national level, is very much a lowish level of investment, both in terms of CAPEX for new work. In terms of the ongoing costs, it's not necessarily a question that this project will be able to address for you, because essentially, as I said before, we're just looking at funding and options for funding.
We'll jump in, Janine.
I just wanted to pick up on that stage 2. I guess what the team is saying is that this project will respond to what those input costs are. It's not trying to review to set what that level of spend is. That's for council to do. What this is doing is saying, if that is what you're going to spend, how is that allocated across the community based on the rationale? So I think this graph is lifted from our current infrastructure strategy. So that obviously dates back to 2024. There'll be a bunch of assumptions that sit within that around inflation, the accuracy of the projections out 50 years. All of those things factoring in there as well.
Thanks for that clarity, Janine. Ben?
Oh, you just at the risk of taking Gary's chocolate fish, I thought he raised a good point about the yellow obviously is significant, and you mentioned there includes depreciation. That's not mentioned in your analysis, and maybe it needs to be, and whether it's possible to.
And revaluation impacts on affordability.
Well, there's a fight for chocolate fish here between you and Gary then, isn't there? Someone's desperate. So whether the yellow can actually be broken down into how much the depreciation would be, or whether that's too difficult to do, I don't know, but it helps explain it.
That's a very good point. Thank you, Councillor. We will absolutely take that on board, because things like depreciation and interest costs are not normally what people would think of when it comes to OPEX. So yes, we need to explain that better.
No.
So just on that depreciation, we got Janine and Greg in the room, I think it was end of last year, and we went through some real examples. The recent one was the Churchill East pump station, and what the impact of depreciation was. And yeah, you had a $6 million project at the end of life, 80 years. It was, I don't know, was it worth 50 million or something, but the revaluation, I can't remember, I'm just using a figure. But without that understanding of depreciation, so just as a thought, not that I want to add to the document too much, but so people actually get an understanding of how depreciation is applied in a local government context, because as a farmer, and there's several businessmen in the room, that we account for it differently in our business as we do here in local government, and it needs to be understood. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very, very good suggestion. We will absolutely take that up because, yeah. One of the things about this that is interesting about this graph, of course, and to take you back in history just a touch, as you're aware, a great many schemes were either started or completed, back in the day when, prior to the 1980s, when central government was a big contributor to flood protection infrastructure in particular, right? And so with the reforms of the 80s, all of that got lumped on ratepayers. Now, one of the effects of that is that communities can only afford a certain level of rates. And so what we saw in the before the deluge business case is that we had an overhang of underinvestment that was a natural occurrence of central government no longer contributing to important infrastructure, right? And so what you're seeing in the yellow part of this graph is the need that has come forward is to reinvest, because there is this overhang of accumulated projects that need to get done, and that has very much come to the fore. And it's only been in the last few phases, or the last few tranches of the government providing that 60-40 funding split, that councils have been able to begin to catch up on this deficit that has applied. The problem is, of course, that then generates an OPEX burden for depreciation. And this is why in this business case, in the next business case that's going up, this is why it's now being proposed that government contributes not only to the CapEx, but also to the OPEX, because the OPEX burden is significant.
Keith, did you have a follow-up question on this?
Yeah, so thanks, Warren. It's probably tied up with this, but having been involved in the flood protection stop banks and that sort of thing, and 10, 15 years ago, one of the big issues was the cost of it. Okay, so that actually feeds into this whole graph system. And the original stop banks were used for out of material on site. And then we got into this ridiculous situation. We went to Rolls-Royce. So while if you're applying the government, you want the maximum cost possible, but in actual fact, on the ground, I'm just cautioning you. I think we're probably getting too pedantic about the level of material and that sort of thing, particularly for stock banks, which is that's a long-term fixed asset.
Again, I think, Keith, we're getting a slightly off topic. Like I refer you back to Janine's question or comments earlier around the figures that are here in front of us. We're not going into the material that makes up the stock bank and whether it's a Rolls Royce or a go-kart. It's the process that they're looking at to how we fund across. So we need to stick to topic, or we'll be here all night. And it's not a Rolls Royce go-kart either. Thank you, Noel. Back to you, Ken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So pages 26 and more importantly 27 is basically what the current revenue approach is and where the revenue comes from. And that second pie graph down the bottom is the important one. This is both flood protection and drainage, 84% out of targeted rates, 12% out of general rates, other incomes 3%, and government grants are 1%. Now, the key thing is that what we're trying to do is get that government grant section changed quite significantly. And you can see that if we succeed in doing that, then the impact on the targeted rates and to a great degree, and the general rates to a lesser degree, will change fundamentally. So this is why the Te Ure Kahika work is so critical, simply because at the moment, 84% of this does come out of a target rate, as you're all aware.
Kent, just on that, I do have notes on my document that I haven't shared with the team. But of the targeted rates, obviously they are at different scales as well. So some of it is actually more akin, it's still a rate, but it's more akin in some ways to a general rate. So I think just for councillors not to be having in their heads that targeted rate are all around those direct beneficiaries, as we currently classify them as direct beneficiaries, they are zone, catchment, region, scale as well.
And that's why I've asked for the targeted rates for drainage to be broken out, because they are specific to landowners, whereas the rest of it is actually the contributors, the watershed type funding. So, you just lump it all together, it's a bit confusing. So that's why I've asked for that to be split out.
Yeah, point taken, noted.
That's Robbie in the dining car, yeah.
So pages 28, 29, we talk about Project Watershed. Again, we won't worry too much about that. That's mainly for people who don't have that context. And then we step into the challenges on page 31. And there are a number of these. Legislation, obviously, what central government is expecting us to do, affordability, the costs and benefits, land use change, and climate change. So all of these confluence of factors are driving the need for reinvestment and the need for better and more equitable funding options. We could probably spend the rest of the afternoon talking about everything on page 31, what the government is currently doing. And by the time we'd finished that, undoubtedly there would be a new announcement on the table. So unless anyone particularly wants to talk to that subject, we'll continue on. Affordability on pages 32 and 33. This is the case for both businesses and communities. And again, I don't think needs reiterating too much around this table, because we live and breathe these issues all the time. But both at the scheme level and at the general rate level, there are serious issues with affordability. Just to give this a bit of context, for every dollar that is taken in taxation in this country, 91 cents ends up in Wellington and 9 cents ends up in the communities. Right? And it is that disparity and the fact that we're overly reliant on rates that is a big underpinning cause of this problem. So we can't do anything about that. We don't propose to fix that in this report, but that is the thing that is driving really, affordability, because it sits on such a narrow revenue base. And that's why we need to see the taxation revenue that has come from other places flow back into regional councils via the Te Ure Kahika initiatives.
Use your mic, we've got guys online.
91 cents in Wellington from what was that? From the dollar?
So this is work that's come out of NZIER, amongst others.
Yep.
For every dollar of taxation, 91 cents
All
goes
taxation.
all taxation.
Taxation.
Yeah, 91 cents goes to Wellington, 9% stays in the region. Pages 34 and 35. Page 34, we do have a mismatch between who pays and who benefits, and that's really a case of Project Watershed put this on a very firm foundation 20 years ago, but the world has changed. Land use has changed, settlement patterns have changed, the requirements have changed. So this is the core issue that we're trying to grapple with at the moment. And again, Waikato finds itself as kind of leading the charge on this nationally. The things we're grappling with here are likely to be cases for other regional councils everywhere else in the country in the coming decade. And of course, as page 35 notes, we do have land use change. Mainly that's around settlement patterns and agriculture patterns. When we built some stop banks in the 1950s or 1960s, that might have been relatively low value land. Since then, it's been used for much higher value horticulture, or it's been turned into a subdivision, or You know, there's a whole bunch of things that have changed, and that change in land use patterns is a big driver behind what's required for level of service. And then page 36 touches on the issue of climate events. As you can see, the number of days spent in states of emergency is increasing relatively dramatically. Some of that is down to reporting, but the majority of it is just down to the number of events that we're seeing. And that's challenging the whole system.
Chris?
Yeah, I challenge that. We saw what happened recently with our phones were going off every 20 seconds for emergencies. Nothing happened. And that didn't used to happen back in 2002 when it started. So I really challenge the value of that graph.
Yeah.
From a practical point of view.
Yeah. They're kind of, it's interesting drilling into that data because obviously, you know, if people could have hassled this in 2002 over our phones, they probably would have. But, you know, so the technology exists now. One of the things that is really interesting is that the number of states of emergencies is going up, but there's a disparity between councils. So if we do a lot of work in Tairāwhiti, for instance, in Gisborne. Gisborne District Council, Head Stoltz near there is on record as saying that they now see weather events that 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, they would absolutely have declared a state of emergency for. But they don't do that anymore because basically their emergency operations centre is now almost an entrenched council function and they just simply don't bother because they were doing that anyway. It's become business as usual. So their number of states of emergency, you know, is not climbing in a massive way. But what we are seeing is that in areas of the country where they haven't traditionally had those big weather events, that's where the number of states of emergency is going up and going up relatively dramatically. And that's simply because the councils, by and large, aren't set up for those yet because they haven't traditionally had to deal with them. So you're right, there is some change in the data there, but what it says is that, you know, the number of events does not seem to be going down.
I think too, mayors and chairs have had input from the minister that if you're going to go early. And again, we all know weather forecasting isn't super accurate to where that is. So your phone might have gone off, Chris, but I'm picking Rodney Dow's phone went off quite a bit too down in Otaronga. So it's all relative to areas at times. No.
Yeah, I'm just as someone who farms on the Waipawa River, I'm very conscious. So I go back to the 70s when it was dry. 1998 was the first big flood since 58, then 2004, 2008, 12, and there was one or two in the late teens. And then we had October last year and more recent, but that's flooding events, not emergencies. And so this is New Zealand days. I'm just wondering about the Waikato context, because that's what we're looking at, the Waikato context versus the national. So if you're going to want to show the national, watch the Waikato context, and that's relevant to the people who are being potentially rated on this. So perhaps we can just address that in some way.
That's actually a very good point. I'll go back to Dr. David Hood down in Otago University. That's actually his graph, and ask him if we can separate out the Waikato data because it would be interesting to see that.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There'll be a
This
trust
stuff
scene.
has been my life.
Yeah.
You know, the river is so important to my financial viability. I dig into this all the time.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, our mine and thus the region. Yes.
Yep. Thanks. That's a very helpful pointer. The next page over, which is page 38, 39. This is our graph that gets a diagram that gets a bit split across the page. Just to say we're going to re-engineer this because our readability is not a strong point at the moment. It was a very good way of working out some ideas, but we're going to question whether in fact we need that for the wider readership. Any thoughts there would be welcomed. See how they go on the chocolate fish index. Pages 40 and 41, this is where we begin to introduce the work. So essentially we're saying Page 40, we're saying this is the proof of concept. And 41 begins to link two things that traditionally have not been linked particularly well, which is the work of the river managers in the flood modelling in particular, and the analysis that would typically end up in Blair's world of the cost and benefits of this. So we're saying we're taking two things that have actually been council functions for a very, very long time, and we're joining them together simply because that's what the technology is now permitting us to do. And the purpose of that is, as much as anything else, to give good confidence around good decision making around this table, but also to inform communities better, particularly when it comes to the options. Then over the page 42, we talk about the process we go through. So the diagram, the circle at the top, hazard, exposure and vulnerability. These are the standard methodologies used in the sector. So this is how we assess flood risk and its impact. The second one down, we then look at the tangible and intangible effects and the direct and indirect costs that are associated with that. And we use cost benefit analysis and social return on investment analysis to look at those components. And then at the bottom, that's how we get to the valuations. You know, where do the costs and benefits fairly fall and who should contribute what? And remembering, of course, that all of that is set against the background of affordability. So who can, so it's all very well to say the benefits fall to this group, but if they can't afford it, then what do we do about that? Okay, everyone reasonably happy at this point?
Looks that way.
Looks this way, okay. My chocolate fish debt is rapidly rising, but that's fine. Okay, so when we, on page 43, we talk about economic and social vulnerability. So this is the ability of communities to absorb adverse events. We start with the idea of where's the water going to go and what is it going to damage, but then we have to look at both the physical vulnerability and the social vulnerability. Some communities are well insured and they have a lot of social resources, they have a lot of economic resources. Yes, they are affected by flooding, by adverse events. Other communities, on the other hand, are underinsured or not insured at all, and the effects of that same event with the same level of physical damage could be quite destructive. And there's work out there from Professor Illinois at the Victoria University showing that some of the effects from, for instance, the Christchurch earthquake in the more vulnerable communities still stretch out 15 years later. So this is the sense of what are the social vulnerabilities as much as the physical vulnerabilities. And that's what we're attempting to begin assessing for the first time. Page 44 is a little bit technical. What it does is it says, how do we calculate the impacts of a flood? And we look at the property damage and loss, the disruption cost, the recovery or the treatment cost, and the human cost. And you'll see in that table on the left-hand side, we're setting out whether that's directly impacted, indirect, tangible costs, whether the costs are there, but they are completely intangible. So a good example might be, what's a direct tangible cost? That's the car that got flooded, right, and got destroyed as a result. What's the intangible cost? Was the mental health issues that came up from having to take on more debt in order to buy a replacement vehicle because it wasn't insured, and the stress that plays out in the families some years later. So that's kind of the summary of it all. Okay, and the thing that we're really interested in, councillors, is does that kind of have a logical flow to it? In other words, does it sort of take you from the problems and leaf you through to how we're then going to do the assessment? That's kind of the open question. And there are chocolate fish associated with that one. It's going to cost me big time. Okay, section 3, the analysis methodology. So this is the more technical part of the document, right? And it does make a few leaps of faith that firstly, people find this interesting, and secondly, that they find it engaging. So the first thing that we do on pages 48, 49 is we do the risk assessment. So this is where the modelling comes in. So flood risk on page 50, hazard times exposure times vulnerability. So that's what is the hazard? In other words, what will happen if the stop banks are breached or that there are other failures? What is the exposure? You know, the degree to which my property is low lying or floodable, and the vulnerability, both economic and social, when that occurs. So this is very, very well travelled distance. Mr. Cochrane here is an expert on this stuff nationally, and this is the methodology used by the river managers and by the engineers to figure out the degree of impact. So you'll see on page 51, this is just the diagrammatic version. This is how it's normally presented. Hazard assessment, exposure assessment, risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, that feeds into some layers in the GIS system where we run some flood models, and the flood models then produce a relative risk assessment. And that's, you can see obviously in the GIS exactly how that's going to play out for specific communities and specific businesses. Is everyone reasonably comfortable with this? Okay, page 52. This is about the hazard assessment approach. So when we say there's a hazard, what do we actually mean? The answer is how much water is there? Where's it going to go? And how does it move? Does it move rapidly? Does it pond? Does it stay there for a long period of time? And the diagram on page 53 shows you how we take all of that and we go, okay, here's the approach that we take all the way down to producing an output, which in this case is a layer within the GIS system where all of the bits that we don't want to turn blue because they have water in them. Page 54 is the exposure assessment approach. So this is the next step in the process. So we basically go, who is exposed to this? And they can be exposed through a bunch of different mechanisms, not least of which is being a resident or having your business in the affected area. In this case, what we've done is we've set the scope around people who have some kind of direct financial participation in the effect. So that's the reason being, from the point of view of the Waikato Regional Council, that even if someone is, if they are indirectly affected in some way, but they are not resident in the Waikato or have some financial engagement with the Waikato, we really don't, we're excluding them as stakeholders. So a good example is, let's say you're the local franchise owner of the Starbucks, okay, and you get flooded. Who does it affect? It affects you, because you're the business owner. It affects your employees because they're employees. It affects your supply chain because, those are the people who are bringing you cups of coffee. Does it affect the international shareholders in the Starbucks franchise? No. For the purposes of this, they are out of scope. If they are running their business effectively, they are insured, they're not resident in New Zealand, they don't pay rates, all of that stuff, that's done by the local business.
Gary, yeah.
Just going back, trying to absorb it as you're going, but in the hazard assessment part of it, obviously, with this whole thing modelling anyway, around the climate side of it, I suppose there's a lot of variabilities. So, what percentage of margin are you putting on, say, if there's a given line in the science about where things are going to go? Are you adding or taking away from the variability of that, or are you just taking the line?
Probably depends on the approach that you take to the flood modelling. So flood modelling, in terms of testing this concept, we've picked up from the work that the Regional Council was doing for Karakia. They've made a number of assumptions on various flooding scenarios, both in terms of river fluvial flooding, but also sea level rise and inundation, particularly below Queens Valley. They've looked at a range of intensities on how that might change over time. For the purposes of us needing to test this, we've just selected one, and it could be one of a number. What we would do in future is test the sensitivity of that and the losses incurred depending on the magnitude of that event one way or another. So we wouldn't necessarily settle on one flood event being the event that we would pin our hats on. We would look at a range of future scenarios, a range of flooding scenarios. How does that impact differently on the things that we value, and where do the costs and of that flood lie? And they might lie in different places depending on the magnitude of that event. Well,
Thanks for that, because I would think from a planning point of view and future proofing that very small margins could have massive cost implications. Like we can blow out hundreds of millions very, very quickly by a couple of percent change. So it's going to be important, I think, to go forward how we pick those lines and how we the sensitivities around that.
and that could be as much as a challenge for adaptation planning as it is for this one. Because I think you're dead right. Might reach a situation where you could continue with, let's say, investing in some form of flood resilience to the extent that the cost for that investment starts to exponentially increase simply because of the level of service that it provides. And it does come back to your point that you made earlier on in terms of that changing expectation over time as well.
I think that's one of the things I've noticed being on that Karakia adaptation group, and it's one of the criticisms that people always criticise the modelling. So they have done a lot of work in that space to then come out and ground truth it. But obviously everyone recognises that there's a lot of variables in that space. Where is groundwater sitting at when you get that 1 in 100 year event, et cetera, et cetera. So and what I've seen, that's where there's a lot of public distrust too. In the modelling, they'll find a line on a district council map now that says they're in a floodplain. My place is never flooded. You're going to kill my chances of selling it, or my insurance is going to go through the roof, all that sort of thing. So it's something that we've got to be, to Gary's point, really careful and sensitive of when you actually put some things down and take it out to the public. Yeah, it's certainly that's come through. It came through in Karakia Coast as well, which is Kaiawa, and again in Hauraki. No.
Yeah, I think we're on page 56, aren't we?
Not quite that far ahead.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
I thought we were. I'll wait a moment.
So there's
Still be
there's
page.
yeah, the thing about these models is that there's a very good saying about modeling, which is that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. Right? Because remember, they are models, they are not reality. Right? And the other good saying that I like about modeling is the best model of a cat is a cat. So in other words, the acid test sooner or later is how does it translate into reality? Now, the thing about these models is that the valuations are independent of the model. So in other words, the methodology for how we work out where the impacts are going to occur and who they're going to occur to and how they'll be affected don't depend on settling on the individual model itself. So the purpose of this is so that council can run different scenarios over time and see how the results compare. There is this real issue when it comes to river managers, right? Because they are, largely invisible in council. If there is a major weather event and all of the infrastructure works as we expect and nothing happens, or at least very little happens, then we tend to go, well, the river manager's invisible, didn't see it, right? My place didn't get flooded, didn't even know it was a thing. I didn't recognize the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars that have gone in to make that the case. If it does flood, if something does occur, so it exceeds, the capabilities of the infrastructure, then everybody's unhappy. So if you're a river manager, you're either ignored or you're hated. There's nothing sort of much in between. So the purpose of the modelling is to provide the community, as much as anybody else, with a little bit of a sense of what could happen in different scenarios. Doesn't mean that they all are going to happen, but it is a way of exploring the possibilities and nothing else. Okay, exposure assessment. Sorry, councillor, did you want to?
Yeah, no, the top of page 56, left-hand column, and then on 60. I took those as statements from which the page follows. And I think I know what the vulnerability is analysed both two lenses, blah, 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 that, you know, that what, and then on 60 it says this illustrates potential impacts, which are then what. So someone's probably rushed a bit of work here, but it's critical if that sort of sets the scene for the following pages.
Yep.
And I still would like to understand what 56 is trying to say.
6.
Top of page.
Maybe through instead of the word
through
both.
through both lenses.
Yeah.
And then social vulnerability, that what?
Yeah. You're entirely right. I announced the Chocolate Fish Award. Yeah. So basically, what we're trying to do is overlap the idea that there is physical vulnerability, but also social vulnerability, and those build on one another. So, do I have vulnerability because my house is in a floodplain? Yes. Do I have social vulnerability because, I am elderly, I am unwell, I have limited mobility, I require people to assist me every day with health issues? Yes, my social vulnerability is very high.
And then when do we ask the question, was I dumb enough to buy in a floodplain? Is it my fault? You know, it's about time we did. Sorry.
Look, you're entirely right. And the thing is, individuals are individuals. So they may come back and say, I inherited this house from my parents and I've lived here for 45 years. So, so that's what essentially the social vulnerability index is all about, is the degree to which, people are affected to different degrees.
Did you have a question, Gary?
Yeah, could you point out, I don't know if it's in the right context as usual, but could you point out I don't see any mention of the power companies and the extra water from the Wanganui coming in that's added to the lower Waikato's flooding issues, which is 10 to 15%.
You're right, it's out of context.
Okay, it's out of context. Is it included in here anywhere?
It kind of is in a roundabout way, in the sense that the flood models look the way that they do. One of the exacerbator effects is the water coming in from higher up in the catchment, right? So would the flood models look like they do if that water wasn't there? No, they would be quite different, and therefore our hazard, our exposure, our vulnerability would all be different to the way they are today. So the way the modeling's been done is we are where we are. Right? Attributing the cause of the flood, on the other hand, what are the exacerbators? Yes, we come to that later in the piece.
Yeah, but there will be a financial contribution from the generators, which is everybody in New Zealand to run these things, toward flood.
We should be so lucky. I mean, obviously, from a Waikato Regional Council perspective, we don't have the ability to do anything more than our powers is defined under the Local Government Rating Act and Public Finance Act and related legislation. Right. So, at the moment, for instance, we provide flood protection for a lot of NZTA's roads. Can we extract a single dollar from them to help achieve that? No, there's a very complex economic term for this. They're freeloading.
I challenge that?
Yeah, I'll challenge that. Sorry. The context that Project Watershed was brought in was because the North Waikato River Watch challenged the resource consents, which are coming up for renewal again in the next year or so, for all of the Mighty River power schemes. The challenge was, if you're not going to contribute to the protection of the farmers in the lower Waikato, we will oppose the diversion of the Tongariro diversion from the Wanganui River into Taupo, putting 10 to 15%. Because of that, Project Watershed was put in place. So to say now that, oh no, they're freeloading, that is not acceptable to farmers in the lower Waikato. About another 25 years on, there will be another challenge within the next year if that's the case. which may mean that they get shut off. So it's got major implications.
I completely concur with everything you said, Councillor. The key thing is that from the point of view, like in this work, can we recognise where the costs and benefits fall? And the answer is yes. Does that mean, on the other hand, that the council can go and extract money out of the generators? And the answer is, under the current legislative environment, I'd say the answer is pretty much no.
Is it watershed?
That only extend the extent that power companies pay rates on some of the land that they have.
No. Under project watershed, the building of the stop banks up, the maintenance, the power for the running of the pumps is subsidised out of project watershed. And that was why it was set up in the first place. So this seems like a bit of a smoke screen smudging going on here to me. I know my constituents in the Lower Waikato will be asking that question.
Can I just follow on from this, please? Yeah, I think our constituents, and I'm dealing with them regularly, I'll be up there again on Thursday. The issue is in the 50s, 60s, the government contributed millions and millions and millions of dollars to flood protection and underwrote most of the schemes that were put in place. They've just come in with Kanoa funding before the deluge. They're putting in millions and millions and millions of dollars. And that's a contribution that is protecting the flood prone land, etc. So whilst people want the government to put more and more, they are actually putting in, and people are having a very short memory that they haven't. And we can take this offline because I know it's a subject that's dear to your heart, but the reality is government contributes significantly at a time, and in a future time, which is now, they're contributing much more. So, you can't have everything in life. I've learnt that, but we can ask, but you're flogging a dead horse, I think.
Right, Chris.
Yeah, look, I think we should just take this offline.
Yep.
I was involved in that scheme when it was put in. I know it's involved. That gives us resilience for our power supply. Fills up Lake Taupo. It's got nothing to do with what's going on down the river. So I think we just forget about it, to be honest.
Right, moving on.
Moving on. Page 60, we basically put all the layers together. Right? And this is, there's a placeholder image on page 61, which, you folk would have seen in the actual GIS systems of this is what a flood event looks like. So that gets us through this logical series of steps necessary to go, this is what occurs in this particular flooding scenario. And as we said, the flooding scenario is just a scenario. It's not necessarily reality, but the idea is you can try out different scenarios and see what the effects are.
Then just take you back to the front cover. Having a nice pretty picture of Hamilton is completely irrelevant to this work. We need a flood, an event on the front page. Not a pretty picture of Hamilton.
Yeah, we always have this debate with Te Uru Kahika as well. Oh, like, do we want to put a document in front of ministers that's all about disasters, or do we want to put the aspirational thing? But look, you will be led by.
I don't want to be Hamilton. People of the Waikato. Yeah, if you're talking about flooding, let's have a real what we're trying to prevent or deal with. Thank you.
We can do that. Okay, so page 62. This is where we start quantifying the impacts. So in other words, we've done the modelling of the impacts themselves. Now we've got to try and put some dollar figures on it. And this is where we're using cost benefit assessment and we are using social return on investment to understand those. So page 64 largely repeats the things around direct tangible impacts, indirect impacts, direct and indirect intangibles, et cetera, and then page 65 just kind of walks through what those might look like in real life. When it comes to page 66, we then talk about what are the direct tangible impacts, damages, because these are actually the easy things to calculate. So this is buildings damaged, buildings destroyed, vehicles flooded, crops destroyed, all of that stuff, right? And there's a lot of good literature. There is a lot of good data. And you'll see at the top of the page, there is the equation. Direct tangible loss equals the asset value times the damage percentage times the various multipliers that apply. And both council and, for instance, Tonkin and Taylor have very good data on all of this and how we go about calculating it. The following pages really then from page 68 onwards goes, okay, so what are those damages? And these are just examples, but essentially you go, well, here is the effect of different flood depths on different types of building. At what point do we say it is damaged? At what point do we say the building is red stickered and destroyed? So this is just a way of going, this is how we begin calculating these things for different types of structures. And in this case, we're getting the structure information from the rating databases. So essentially, we know that the building is of a certain age and a certain construction. We do some maths, and therefore we go, in the extent of this flood area, this is the asset damage that has resulted. If you go over the page again, we talk about rural asset cost and loss, okay? And then community cost and loss, because again, different building types. And by the time you get to page 72, it's really a case of then beginning to sum those up. On page 73, we talk about all the other things other than buildings. So we talk about contents, about stocks and inventories, if you're buildings, if you're a business, and things like vehicles. So these are, again, from either regional or national data, and we're effectively just doing the inventory of these things. We know how many households there are, the average number of cars owned per household, likely value of those vehicles. Now, all of this is approximation, but it's done in a consistent way. So does this mean that we can get an individual coming up and saying, hey, my car's worth much more than that or much less than that? The answer is yes, but at the aggregate level, this is what we know from the regional and national data. And then we basically add all of those things up. Does that make a bit of sense? So it's the easy bit to some degree. Page 74 then goes, okay, so what are the other tangible costs that we add on? And the answer is there's things like temporary relocation expenses, there is the cost of emergency response, the health costs, the cleanup costs. Again, all of those things that are direct tangible results of that particular event. Okay, and again, we tend to use the literature in order to be able to work our way through those, as well as data from individual councils, for instance.
Janine.
Yeah, so this approach would be quite a significant shift away from the way that we currently think about and fund our recovery costs, which effectively is quite separate to the funding of the rest of the scheme. So I think this is quite a critical point for elected members. So this would be effectively the full cycle of asset management through to recovery. Whereas at the moment we need to set aside some provisions under a different funding mechanism for disaster recovery reserve, so our self-insurance, which is, let's say, different to the way that we're actually funding asset maintenance and operations.
Christian,
I want to check that my understanding is correct, but I think to highlight that is quite a significant change, and I think a really good one in this approach.
I just asked Janine, how much of that's covered by insurance that we carry, Janine?
Typically nothing. And our challenge is because a lot of the work that we do or the damage that we incur is not asset related damage. It's the cleanup, it's the channel clearance. So we, touch wood, have not triggered an insurance claim following an event to date. Our threshold, our deductible is $500,000. So we have to reach that to start with. And so we have had in place these both zone and regional disaster recovery reserves that we lean into outside of normal operating budgets to actually be able to respond after an event.
So for a major event which triggered the $500 million,
500,000 into, yeah.
we would be covered.
We would, but until we get to that threshold, and that is if
Self-insured,
it's associated with asset damage or an insurable loss, we're on our own. So there are some insurance alternatives that we can look at around that, but this piece of work will help us think a bit differently in that space as well.
Just for clarity on that then, so when you're talking about assets, are you actually talking about things like stop banks and too? So yeah, so that includes all that.
Yeah, and just to pick up Janine's point, these funds can exist in other places in the council budget. What we're doing in this work is recognising them though. So we're pulling them in there. And that also applies incidentally to the work done in terms of emergency response by the district councils and the city councils, not just the regional council itself. So we're saying, look, from the point of view of the region, all of those costs are there and they have been borne by somebody, even if it's not necessarily in the thing that you would immediately regard as being a flood protection budget. Okay, page 77. This is the bit where we start on the indirect tangible losses. So this is largely revolves around the economic disruption that occurs as a result of the event. So what happens is there is a flood event. We can go, let's say that it was affected some retailers. We know about the damage to the building and how long that's going to take to repair or remediate. We know about the damage to stock. What we're now assessing is how did that affect their turnover? What are the wider economic effects that come from that? So in other words, what's their loss of revenue or loss of productivity that comes from this? And so this is both regular, like retail businesses, but it's also rural businesses. So there is a loss of business revenue, a loss of labour income, and then the recovery related costs that associate with it. This is again based on regional data, national data, and the methodology is one that's used internationally to be able to calculate those things. If you go over to page 78, we're talking about each of those, and on page 79, you'll see the formulas that we're using to calculate. Now, the data here is going to not be accurate for individual businesses. It's only accurate at the regional level. So in other words, if we assume that a retailer is of a certain size, that retailer will have a certain level of productivity per square metre, right, and a certain level of revenue per square metre. We assume that dairy farms, for instance, have a certain revenue per hectare. So those are the kind of scales that we're using. They won't be accurate down to the level of individual businesses. But in terms of the flood affected area, particularly in a large event, that suffices to say, here are the impacts that we have to take account of when we are, protecting or not protecting, land of this type. Is that making sense? Okay. All right. So page 80, we then add those together and we look at essentially in this work, two kinds of scenarios. One is, I'll come back to why we do that, but essentially we look at a banks up scenario and a banks down scenario. So the banks up scenario is, here is the flood protection infrastructure as it stands today. Banks down scenario, this is what it would look like if the stop banks didn't exist. And the reason that we're doing that is so that we can say, here is the value of what we are protecting with the current infrastructure. And if you have a think about it, that means that what we've got is our return on investment. So essentially we've made the investment in flood protection infrastructure. It's on our books for $1.22 billion. If it didn't exist, what would be the effect of just a single flood? And the answer is a very large number indeed. That's essentially the bank's down scenario. So what we've immediately done is said, for that investment that we as a region and we as a country have made, here is the return we are getting from that every time there is a major event. Which is there on page 81, this page to be added.
Can I jump in here? And I've given this feedback, but I'd like to discuss it a little bit because it's been a pet issue of mine for many, many years now. So I've got at the top of the page, this needs better understanding. In a 1 in 100 AEP, 1%, it actually equates to 3.65 days per annum. It's not every 100 years, because I can tell you I've had 1 or 2 100-year events in my short time, and I didn't, so the average person out there, and we will eventually be talking to the non-landowner or rural, asking them to fund for certain reasons. So I'd like to see an explanation of sort, or something that says like a 1 in 10 year, that's 36.5 days of the year that there could be a ponding event or flooding. A 1 in 30 year is 12.5 days of the year, and a 1 in 100 is 3.6 days a year. The reality is, 1 in 100 doesn't mean a damn. Talk to the average person in Hamilton, what does that mean to them? But to the rural community, some people think, well, why have we got a 100-year flood when we had one 10 years ago? Yeah. The reality is, it's the percentage, it's the AEP that, and what does 10% actually equate to? I think we could have a better explanation, please.
Yeah, and point taken. I think some illustrations around there are quite powerful.
Yeah.
But for those that are not familiar with the statistics,
because if someone says 1 in 100, rubbish. It's 3.65 days a year. So every year we could have one of that magnitude.
Yeah.
And with the more frequent, and I also have a question here, are flood size descriptions still relevant due to the increased frequency of large scale events? Well, you've got to have a baseline. And I think that's essential to keep that. And that's why people need to understand how many days a year that might happen.
Look, I think there's some useful clarification that we could put in there in terms of how many times it might be expected within someone's lifetime for an event of a certain magnitude to occur.
Yeah, just probably further to Noel's comment, I guess some of those levels of service are sort of baked into asset design as well, which is part of the challenge. So where they were designed at a point in time to 1 in 100, what does that actually mean now in terms of the level of protection? So, yeah.
Keith, you had a comment?
Yeah, just a question. I'm just trying to understand page 80, and I don't see a reference point. So what's it based on in terms of trying to understand this data? So is the business worth $1 million, or what's the?
Yeah, that page is still a work in progress, very much, because this is the bit where it gets a little bit technical. And so we were at the point where we were providing you the draft, we were wrestling with how we express this in a way that makes sense to people, to your point, Councillor. The thing is that a lot of it's based on statistical modelling. Statistical modelling doesn't intuitively make that much sense, and we saw that with the Christchurch earthquakes, right? Where we go, here is this event, and it's a 1 in 100 year event, and most people then go, oh, that means that we won't have another earthquake for another 99 years, right? But because, that's the way that most people kind of think about those things. And you go, no, well, the odds of getting an earthquake the next year are also 1 in 100. Right? So it's not like a cumulative thing. It just means it's a frequency test, not so explaining some of this, though, to your point, is not the most trivial thing. And so that page very much is a bit of a confusing mess at the moment as we work through some ideas about how to tease this apart and explain it well. But what we're trying to get to is this idea of there is a huge amount of value that is delivered by not having flood events rock across the Waikato every time there's a really big rain. And that is that's the return we are getting for the investments we've made in flood protection.
Yeah, through you, Chair. Just follow up that. It's probably Noel, being diligent as he is, he's probably asked you that question. But if we are to try to explain this to our communities, it's got to have a relevance to that community and reference points.
That's a very good point. One of the things we thought we kind of need in this document at some point is something that resembles a bit of a case study in the Waikato. So, yeah. Yep. Yep.
Gary,
AEP is what?
Probability.
exceedance probability.
Statistics.
Yeah.
Okay, page 82. This is the bit where we deal with the intangibles. So these are things that it is a lot harder to measure, and these are typically the social impacts. So at this point, we can, we've talked about, we've measured the damage to the home. We've measured the damage to the contents and the vehicles. We've measured the economic effects from the person losing their job because their business got flooded out. And we've measured the economic impacts as those are spread through the community, right, in their supply chains. What we're now talking about is essentially the social impacts that come from this. So that may be things such as my kid can no longer go to that local school because the road access is closed and the school has been flooded out and it's going to be closed for a year. And there's the disruption to the kids' education and all of the friend networks. It's the physical health challenges that come off the back of it. It is the mental health challenges. All of these things fall into the category of social return on investment. So those things are largely we use the current, local and international literature, and what we're beginning to do is then calibrate these for the Waikato. So pages 84 and 85 deal with this idea of social vulnerability indicators. So these are the degree to which the little diagram on page 85, social vulnerability is probably the best little summation. So there's a degree of exposure, which we know from the flood modelling. Basically, are you exposed to this particular event? Then there's the susceptibility. Who is more susceptible to the impacts? And that will be through things like economic circumstances, but also things like age, health, social connectedness, all of those factors. And then there's the lack of ability to cope. And that comes down typically to two things. One is the financial resources that the person has, but the other is the social resources that the person has. So a typical thing is if somebody has good family and social networks around them, their ability to cope is higher than if they don't. So this is the stuff that we intuitively know. So what this does, the social vulnerability indicators, is it begins to put some methodology around the stuff that we all intuitively know and the stuff that communities do for themselves anyway. So if we know that there's old folk who don't have their children close, who have mobility issues, and there's a flooding event, those are the people we go and help first. So that's what social vulnerability indicators do. And over the page 86 and 87, here is the high-level listing of all of these different factors: exposure, susceptibility, lack of ability to cope, and what it gives us is some point locations that we would typically pay attention to. So a good example would be residential care facilities for old folk, or social housing, or emergency housing, things like that. So what we're doing is we're locating these physically on the map, and we're going, if we are going to flood an area, I mean in the model, if that area gets flooded and we are flooding 3 rest homes and we're flooding some social housing, that's going to have a different impact than if we're just flooding a relatively well-off neighbourhood, for instance. So it's a way of calibrating the social vulnerability of people. And again, drawn from physical data, where are these facilities located, but also the demographic data that we have down to a kind of neighbourhood level. Page 88.
Did you have a question, Gary?
Yeah, I do, because I get where you're going with it, but it's so subjective, isn't it? Like, so persons or the social vulnerability often depends on scale. So if it happens to everybody, we're all in this together and we cope with it better. But if it only happens to one house or one home, it's actually your problem and not the community's problem anymore. You just got bad luck and deal with it yourself. And so, you know, not. I suppose I don't have a question there, but I do struggle with that whole social vulnerability because it's a bit abstract for me, you know, and to say how do you quantify that from a mass incident or to an individual incident, but the impact on the individual is the same in both cases.
You're entirely right, councillor. The impact is the same in both circumstances. The question is their ability to cope with it can be very, very different indeed. And that's one of the lessons out of the Christchurch earthquakes, right? Some people recovered a lot faster and to a much greater extent than others. And what we're doing in this work is essentially trying to do that quantification of going, who's going to be more affected than others? And using some of the tool set, which we haven't got too deeply into here, thankfully, we end up with the ability to put dollar equivalent figures on those. And that doesn't mean that there's been dollar damage or that dollars change hands. It's simply a way of calibrating those impacts over time. So there's good literature, good research, for instance, that tells us about in certain socially vulnerable areas, what the mental health effects are going to be over the next 10 to 15 years, and we can put a dollar value on that. Following Hurricane Katrina, for instance, there was a surge in mortality, so people dying earlier in old people or those with disabilities, right? So all that's in the literature, and we can effectively say, here would be the impacts. Now, remembering that what we're doing here is we're not saying, well, that's fantastic, we can measure those things. We're saying these are the factors that count, or some of the factors that count, when it comes to building flood protection infrastructure. It means that we're not doing those things to people. That is part of the benefits that we are getting from this investment we've made over the decades.
So that's great because, you know, basically you guys are engineers, and so, you know, or I hope you are, he is anyway, yeah, which is great because, you know, we like dealing with facts and the social stuff we don't have to worry about. You know, so because it's harder to quantify and cost, and you know, and I wonder from a council perspective, whether we have to get into that social side of it, start factoring into the cost of that, because then, you know, because we can look at COVID as an example, and you want to start talking about those sorts of things, you know, just an example, you use those other, you know, what is the social impact of that 5-10 years down the track? You know, what is the lockdown in Auckland, and how do we measure that? And it's really hard to start quantifying that. And if we're going to start trying to do budgets or frame that up in a cost of a benefit to the region, I'd say we start getting into very dangerous territory. And I'd rather stick with the engineers and say, what's the cost of infrastructure, a house, and the economic impact rather than the social impact.
From an engineering point of view, you then risk underestimating the value of the investment that you're putting in. So, you know, what is it that a particular investment decision X? I struggle with some of the same framing around social return on investment, because I think we'll find, I was going to nudge Ken in this, that I think we'll find that the avoided losses, some of those could be quite substantial when you start to tally them up. So it might be the equivalent to, you know, the avoided losses around asset damage that, you know, is, you know, easier for us to quantify. So it will be a big number. I think council can then choose in terms of how they want to evaluate or use that number in their decision making process as well. But, you know, part of this is then being able to say, well, look, you know, when you're looking at this, you know, we might have tangible losses in the order of $1 billion. Your intangible losses might be in the order of 10 billion. Now, at least you'll have an idea of where some of the avoided costs or the benefits from flood control and drainage might sit there.
Because the other effect of this is, because you're entirely right, councillor, council is not responsible for the social impacts, right? I mean, it's not a social agency in that sense. But one of the things we're doing in this work is recognising that those costs largely fall on the government. They fall in the health sector and they fall in the justice sector and a whole bunch of other places, right? And remember, this is part of this wider debate with the Crown that says the effects of all of this infrastructure that us local ratepayers pay for and maintain, you, the Crown, as the insurer of last resort and the provider of all those social services, if we don't find a way of equitably and sustainably funding this, those costs are going to fall on the government anyway. Right? So all we're doing in this work is quantifying how big those numbers are. And Peter's point is well made, which is some of the social costs can even outweigh the asset costs. If we restrict it to asset costs, then the government has a tendency to say, oh, well, if that's a business indirect cost of flooding, well, the business should go insure itself. It's not our problem. Right? Or more people should have car insurance and then they'd simply be able to pay it out, because we're not reflecting the social impacts that come from it. And effectively, we're not saying that council should be responsible for those, or even necessarily that council should take them into account when making infrastructure investment decisions. But what it does do is it enables us to go and have a very informed discussion with the Crown to say, here's what we are saving you to a large degree, and it's not solely about assets, a whole chunk of it is about people.
Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Look, I'm just trying to frame up my thinking on this, but I look at the cost in a area where there's a high risk of flooding. The land value is incrementally lower, and I think of the farmers. Some of the areas in our catchment. So the input, the capital cost of actually buying the productive asset in the first place is a lot lower, but your operating costs are going to be significantly higher because you've got to protect the land. Now, that's a known when you go in there. And I don't think that model should be changed. I don't think anybody else should be burdened with that. That should endure. The other point I'd like to make is about you can't take stupid out of people. And if you look at an example I'm going to give you, which you'll know about, is the Esk Valley. In 1938, I've got photos of that valley that was absolutely decimated. The houses that were there totally flooded. The silt was up to the roof lines. It was no different to what we saw 2 years ago. What they were told after 1938, I'm told, I wasn't around at the time, not like Noel, who has been here a little bit longer. They were told not to rebuild there. But what do? They go and rebuild with no insurance. I don't know who consented the building, but I guess you can't stop people building on their own land if they want to. So what do we end up with? We end up with another disaster. And that's why I can't really get soaked up in the social thinking. I'm sorry, but that's just the way I'm a bloody accountant. And I look at the numbers and it's just, I just cannot understand why we have to go there and factor these things into when we're doing calculations. It just doesn't make sense to me. But that's just my point of view. There's no question. It's just,
Yeah.
Well, you might, as an engineer, you might like to answer it, but we know what's going to happen. It's just a question of when.
You make a very good point, Councillor, because if you are looking at a business, right, and your point about the value of land, if the land floods frequently, then you will typically have a lower capital value associated with buying it, but you'll have higher OPEX costs associated with higher expenses associated with keeping that from flooding so often or mitigating it, right? So that's a known, rational, straightforward business decision, right? And nothing about this is going to change that one iota, nor should it, right? When it comes to the kind of social aspects, however, it's also true that we build the cheapest housing or have the cheapest housing in the places that flood most often. Right? And if you are somebody on minimum wage, you're not making a rational decision about balancing risk and reward and cost and what have you. You're going, rents are very high in this country, and this is the only place I can afford. So I don't have a lot of financial assets anyway. This is the place I can afford. It's the best I can do. I'm not being stupid, but essentially this is all there is in my price range, right? And these are the people who end up being in the front line of what occurs. And certainly in the experience out of Hurricane Katrina in the US, that was very much the case. The poor communities, because they were closest to the river in the most vulnerable areas, they bore the brunt of what happened, both economically, but also socially and in terms of fatalities and everything else. So where people are rationally in control of their decision making, and business owners are a case in point, I completely and absolutely agree with you. In other social circumstances, people aren't always in control of some of these things, right? And they don't always have good choices. So that's why we have to take into account, the social vulnerabilities, because sometimes some of these decisions are outside their span of control. They're just doing the best they can in the circumstances. But as discussed with the other councillor, the purpose of this is not to change the way that council invests, right? Because you folk are very well connected to your communities. You understand the challenges and the opportunities and the strengths and the weaknesses of those communities. You're probably not going to change your investment decision making one iota. This is all about explaining to the Crown that the Crown is the insurer of last resort and the social provider of last resort. This is why they need to be at this table and investing alongside us.
So can I just try and answer that? Would it not be better to take a different sort of approach? Instead of letting people build in the Esk Valley or rebuild in the Esk Valley, the Crown come in and provide some sort of funding that's going to allow them to build in areas which is going to be safe and not incur that sort of high risk, which is going to happen. It's just a question of when, because we end up paying for it anyway. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah. You're entirely right, and I think a lot of people in this room would be very happy with that better planning approach. A couple of years ago, my partner and I went to Japan, and we went and had a look at Fukushima. And one of the things that's interesting about that is that there are standing stones on the hillside that go, "Do not build below this point," right? And some of them were put there in the 1500s. And people did build below those points, and disaster ensued. So this is not a New Zealand specific issue. Yeah.
Didn't say except for nuclear power points.
So I think I read this morning, this morning or yesterday, a community, I think it's up north. The council is looking at relocating the whole community. I know in Australia, after I think the Bendigo floods, they completely lifted a town to a higher level. For 19 years, that's how long I've been at this local government nonsense. I've been advocating for stronger direction from council. Sorry, I've got my deaf ear on. I'll turn it up. That we should have stronger rules in our plan to say, don't build. You cannot build in this area, but we continually see developers coming, and we've got a fast track application out here at Te Rapa, in a swamp that went over a kilometre wide, shallow lake, drained 100 years ago, and we've got a fast track to put hundreds of houses on that. Absolutely ridiculous, but the pressures of, and it's time that councils, the regional plan, district plan, you just can't go there. And this, so until we actually get some, I won't say the word, but anyway, we actually won't achieve a lot. So can I just, if I may, with your leave, because I need to go, on page 100, it talks about contribution and majors capability. I've actually written, don't go there. If you own land, you must contribute to the protection. If you can't afford it, sell it. And then there's another comment here about ability, I think it is. Maybe it's the next. So ability to pay should not form part of the discussion on solutions. That will skew the discussion on who should pay, and then other mechanisms should be put in place about those who can't afford it, like there are government ability to pay rates or otherwise and subsidies who can't. But if we look at putting the ability to pay into the discussion, we will screw ourselves. So on that note, I'm happy to be contacted outside of this if you want me to talk more about my comments.
Yeah, happy to do that, councillor, and we'll get your forwarding address for the chocolate fish.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And we will add stupidity to the intangible column. Yeah, Keith.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Just going back to Chris Hughes's comments, and obviously my Dutch mate next to me, Gary's comments. What I'm struggling with in this whole thing is, are we, and I guess it's not you that are doing, but are we walking backwards from the good work that we're doing, or are we going to be proactive and say, let's protect the asset? And I'm just thinking about the Dutch situation, and Gary will have been there. You're standing 30 feet below sea level. They've protected themselves. They've got cities there. They've got infrastructure there. They've protected themselves. And we have got, I wouldn't like to use half-assed, but some of it's good stuff and some of it's not so good stuff. And you showed us some of the photographs earlier. I think, like the Karakia Plains, I think we should be building bigger seawalls. It's beautiful lands, good, productive land with opportunity for development. But we're not giving the courage. So I know you're giving us scenarios, but I'm saying, I'm asking the question, are we not making a decision because we don't want to make a decision?
I think the decision that sort of lies elsewhere. What this work will do is help benefit of that decision that's made. So, if you use the lower hierarchies, could build up to a certain level to provide a very high level of protection at a cost to council and council's ratepayers. Whether that cost then generates enough benefit to make that worthwhile is what this work would do. So it enables you to make a more informed decision around that, and then where does that cost for that sit within the community? And you've got some that will be direct beneficiaries of that, and then you've got some that will indirectly benefit from that because of the economic and other activities generated there. So this will help provide that framing and analysis method for you to understand where both the cost for the infrastructure, or where the benefits accrue from the cost of putting something in. And you go more protective, less protective, or somewhere between, and that's a discussion with the council and its community on.
So numbers will be crunched out for us to. They can be under this. Yeah.
So the idea is that you've got a framework for going, because let's say that there's three different things we could do in a specific scheme. We can either invest in more infrastructure, or we can perhaps sacrifice some of the land into nature-based solutions and do things that way, or we could in fact retreat for a particular community, right? Now, we can have that debate at the moment, but the problem is that we can't quantify necessarily what the benefits of those things are. Right? So we can talk about the costs and we can talk about different points of view, but once we complete this work, we can say, okay, so if we increase the infrastructure, it has this cost and it has those benefits. The nature-based solution, it has these costs and those benefits. Retreat, it has these costs and those benefits. And then the community can have that informed conversation. Then you guys can make that kind of informed choice about what the right way forward is. From the point of view of this work, we're kind of neutral as to where you go, right? But the thing that's really apparent from this and from the Te Uru Kahika work is that the investment in flood protection is probably the best investment that this country can make when it comes to hard infrastructure. We know that, for every dollar we tip into it, we get between $4 and $5 worth of benefit. If we build a road, we tip $1 into it, and based on the numbers out of Northland, we get somewhere between 6 and 11 cents. Right? So this makes a little bit less economic sense than flood protection. The problem is that, as we talked about earlier, this rests on a very, very narrow rating base in terms of funding it. And so if we want to do the sort of things that you're seeing in Holland, that was not put in place because a bunch of local landowners got rated to death. Right? That was because they said this is a national strategy and we're going to fund it at a national level. And that's really the important part of this, is that it gives you the tools to make decisions about options, but it also highlights the fact that the current funding base is too narrow and it's highly inequitable.
I've got a question from Robbie online. Robbie?
Yeah, thank you. It sounds like a way better system than using SIDF. Did anyone hear that?
Yeah, we heard it. Thank you. It's a statement, not a
We
question.
heard it,
but
Robbie.
Thank you for your input. Yeah, thank you. Let's keep rolling because we've got a little bit more to get through.
Okay, what we now want to do is hand over to Dr. Hall, who is going to talk about funding from page 92 onwards. This is the
Thanks,
crunchy
Ken.
bit.
I would suggest that we start with page 101, which summarizes those pages from 92 onwards. Essentially, this section of the report lays out a framework for understanding equity. Essentially, here we're teasing out what principles people are intuiting when they're thinking about what's a fair distribution of costs and benefits. And so this framework is one that was endorsed by the Finance and Expenditure Committee, the select committee that undertook an inquiry into climate adaptation 2 years ago. And so there was a cross-party agreement on these principles as being a helpful framework for capturing most of the debate in terms of who should be paying. So the first of these is beneficiary pays. The costs of adaptation, or in this case, flood protection, should fall specifically on those who benefit directly from the goods and services. And so that is consistent with the buyer beware approach that the councillor was talking about earlier, where those who are exposed to the risk and stand to benefit from risk mitigation should be paying for that mitigation. I've got down here some of the examples of this. So, I mean, this just comes from balance sheet spending, but it also comes from targeted rates, which has been a big part of the conversation. Also, user pays mechanisms and so on. These are some of the examples by which beneficiaries can pay for this sort of infrastructure. And the benefits of that are that it gives those asset owners a clear sense of the risks that they're facing. They take personal responsibility for managing those risks. They undertake a buyer beware approach. Some of the cons are that it can actually be hard to implement, to identify who are the benefits for infrastructure of this type, like seawalls, stop banks, and so on, have a very diffuse number of beneficiaries, which can sometimes be hard to identify. And it also doesn't necessarily address the causes of the risks, especially if those risks are being exacerbated by some of the water allocation issues you've been identifying, also land use issues. So it doesn't actually capture that, which is why we have the principle exacerbator pays. So asset owners or property owners who are exacerbating to the risks of flooding. Sorry. Yeah. Entities which are exacerbating the risks. So asset owners in this case, yes, exacerbators. So if there is a causal link to them and the activities that they're undertaking as exacerbating risks downstream, then they therefore should be carrying some of the costs of mitigating those risks. There we go. And this is consistent with a sort of market-led approach where you price in the externalities and you ensure that these asset owners, these property owners are paying for the full costs of production, including those costs which are being borne by third parties. One of the advantages of having this in play is that investment is going directly into the remediation of the issues which are creating and then exacerbating some of these risks. Some of the cons are that there can be challenges to require those asset owners to pay, including some of the some of the problems around whether the legislated authority is there to enforce that payment. But I mean, these are just part of the challenges of exercising these. Councillor Maguire.
Push the button. No, it's died. You've spoken too much, obviously.
So on the record, you're noting that point about the power generators are exacerbators and that they can be held responsible, whereas as I took it from before was that they were like the koi carp, they couldn't be quantified, so too hard basket where they were going to get off scot-free. So now I'm taking it that the point has been taken on board. That good, thank you. That's all I needed.
Absolutely. I mean, the key is really with the exacerbator approach is that you need a clear evidence base to say that that entity has indeed caused the impacts which it's been which have been imputed upon it. Like another example when we last had the meeting was the question about which land use types are contributing most to whether that's high density development and use of impermeable surfaces, which obviously contributes significantly to stormwater.
There's a very easy way.
No, we're leaving that there, Gary. You've made your point. Gary Raymer.
Please do acknowledge in your comms, identifying who are the beneficiaries of an event, So would we be open up to a can of worms about the beneficiaries? And I'll give you a really quick example. We could go down the road of economic impact. So yes, the impact on the entity is direct, and so they are the direct beneficiaries of a stop bank or whatever, the pump station. But the whole region benefits economically if we do that. So, are we opening up a can of worms, or can we tighten that up, or will it be direct or indirect, and how do we just, I suppose, keep us out of the courts?
I think a lot of the specification of this will emerge from the scenarios that Kent has been working on, because that's going to give us a lot clearer picture about where these costs and benefits are falling in a particular use case. I mean, this is essentially an in-principle analysis. I'm setting up the framework to help us as we advance this into making those determinations around where those costs and benefits should lie, and also helping us to understand where they lie already and whether we think that's a fair allocation of these costs and benefits, and therefore whether we want to make decisions about pushing some of these costs and benefits to other parts of the community and finding the grounds for making those sorts of arguments.
I'll just go to Robbie online again. David.
Yep.
Robbie.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I was just wondering, would this be a far better way of analysing the costs and where they lay, of how things have altered with the Whangamarino swamp and Lake Waikiri, of the cost of what changes to drainage and the altering of the river and the way the river runs in? Could that actually relate to the cost of what it's going to cost to fix that sort of scenario at Lake Waikiri and the Whangamarino? Thank you.
Are you gentlemen aware of what he's speaking to? Yeah. Do you want to have a crack at it, Kent?
Okay, so to do that little piece of analysis, what we'd probably need to do is go, where did the costs and benefits fall before the diversions occurred, and what was the sort of the historical setting, if you like. Then a bunch of changes were made, and the costs and benefits of those the effects of that changed quite significantly, right? And then you do, what's the difference between those two things? And then you go, what's the remediation look like? So by the time we remediate it and make changes back into a more sustainable system so that the lake becomes, living again, right? Who would be the beneficiaries of that? And what's the cost of getting from where we are now to this desired future state? And how should that cost be shared out, right? So it'd be a three-step process to do that. It'd be, what did it look like historically before we made the changes? What does it look like now? And what would it look like in the future? And then what are the kind of steps and how would we share the costs between those things? Now, this work won't answer that very specific question in that very specific way, but what it does is it gives you all the tools and the framework to undertake exactly that analysis.
Yeah, thanks for that.
And then
We'll move
quickly,
on,
the
David.
last
Yeah.
two principles.
Thank you for that, because that helps a lot, because like, as I said, CITIF has caused a lot of issues with that, and that would have been.
Thanks, Robbie. We're moving on.
So the public pays principle, the idea that the costs are spread across the society at the national level, especially through tax revenue and transfer of that tax revenue to infrastructure and other goods and services. It can also happen through public debt. This obviously maximizes the spreading of costs across the widest possible sense and can serve some of the distributional objectives, and also can overcome collective action problems to enable public good. Some of the problems of a public pays approach are also well known in terms of maximizing moral hazard and essentially, subsidizing in ways where people don't see the risks and may be induced into risk-taking behavior. And finally, the ability to pay principle, the costs of adaptation or flood protection and drainage in this case should vary with ability, especially insofar as wealthier agents should be paying this. This was the principle that Councillor Smith was very wary of. I think it works in two ways. On the one hand, it recommends that we target disadvantaged households and communities who may not have the means to, as Kent was describing earlier, make the rational decisions and may not have the funds to recover. I think the other end of this, and what I would say to Councillor Smith if he was still here to keep in mind, is that some of the biggest pools of capital for infrastructure are held by private capital markets, which are significantly large, and the government's made a decision, or it's signaled that a preference to use private markets if possible for infrastructure funding. And so I think we need to keep alive to that, what role pension funds, superannuation funds, other sorts of large scale asset managers might play a role, because for them, access to capital is not the obstacle at all. It's really finding the right projects to put that into. So, as I said at our last meeting, it's not my job to recommend the balance of these principles. That's something that should be done by elected officials who are representing their constituencies and carrying, but I hope this is a helpful framework to understand, what balances and trade-offs there might be. On page 102 and especially 103, so what I've done here is really take a really wide view of possible funding and financing instruments that could help to fund different sorts of activities or different sorts of assets that can contribute to flood protection and drainage services. So there's a huge amount of research going on in this space globally as well as nationally, as countries and communities face flood events which are occurring with greater frequency and often with greater intensity. So some of these instruments are innovative and haven't necessarily been implemented here in New Zealand yet. And then some of them are extremely familiar, especially the ones in the far left of this diagram. So what I've tried to do is to break these down into the funding and financing levers that Waikato Regional Council has a direct relationship to and can implement under its existing legislative authority. So you see targeted rates, general rates, user charges, council issued debt, which I understand is not an instrument that Waikato Regional Council uses much. There's also infringement fines for RMA violations and so on, and also as a source of revenue, and also biodiversity offsetting and environmental compensation for developers. So these are the sorts of instruments which are already within your purview. I also added credit-based trading schemes here to recognize the Lake Taupo nitrogen scheme and the role that these sorts of instruments could play as well. And some other instruments will require partnership where the council is partnering with other organisations. So the most significant of these really is LGFA financing, which is where the council accesses most of its debt rather than through private providers. Crown co-funding is another partnership example, like the Regional Infrastructure Fund, where there's a combination of grants from the Crown with council co-investments. Another one here which has legislation but hasn't been used by Waikato Regional Council but has been used by other regional councils is SPV financing. So the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act of 2020, which enables councils to implement a levy in order to create revenue that can pay back private debt. And one of the opportunities there is to access capital for infrastructure, which is not on council balance sheets. It's rather private lenders, private investors who are providing that capital, but it's done in partnership with council in order to implement the levy. So there's other partnership options here, blended finance being a combination of public and private finance, which I have a case study which we'll touch on soon. And then finally on the far right here, there's instruments which are really outside of the purview of local or regional councils rather, but you may have a role in advocating for. Got here sovereign green bonds, Crown funding outright, which as identified earlier was a significant historical source of funding for flood infrastructure. There's environmental taxation, sustainability linked loans and other sorts of financial instruments which banks are starting to issue, private equity, value capture mechanisms, and also insurance mechanisms, especially for providing different forms of risk transfer for your communities, but also for the council itself. So on page 104 and 105, there's a table which really just describes all of these instruments in greater detail. We will be providing an appendix at a later date as well, which goes through these instruments in further detail as a sort of pretty much one page each. What I would say is, this is a wide view of instruments, and by including them, I'm certainly not recommending that that's something that the council pursues. It's just something to open your eyes to the different possibilities that are out there and being discussed and explored, and give you a better sense of where innovation in the space might pop up. And especially, we're living in changing circumstances, and so one never knows when these instruments might become investable in a way that they currently don't seem to be now. On 106 and the next few pages, there's a little section here on taking a portfolio approach, and the gist of it really is that there's no silver bullet to funding and financing in this space, but there might be silver buckshot. There might be just the right portfolio or right mixture of different instruments that if we think of them as that group and think of them in terms of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts, we might be able to select portfolios of instruments which reinforce one another and help to address the gaps. So currently, if you think about how funding and financing is occurring in the space at the moment, it's mostly a combination of beneficiary pays and public pays approaches. I'd say there's not so much funding coming from an exacerbator pays and ability to pay approach. And so if you were thinking about what an equitable balance might look like and what a better portfolio of instruments might look like? Well, we might think that one of the places to start looking is in what sorts of instruments might compel exacerbators to pay for some of this and to essentially pay for some of the costs that they're creating through their activities. And it might also be how to stimulate investment from private capital markets, and whether it's debt or equity. And so the remainder of the section really just puts a spotlight on some of these instruments. Again, the final selection or recommendations of instruments will be something that we narrow in on through the scenarios, because that will get us much closer to the ground in terms of what's actually needed, what are the distributional impacts which are being seen from flooding events. That'll help us to narrow down the instruments available and also get a clearer sense of what sorts of impacts need to be driven on the ground. I'd say just, while we're discussing this topic in terms of private equity, I think there is an opportunity there, but it is a difficult one. As we were talking about earlier in terms of cost and benefit analysis, a lot of the business models, the investment case for infrastructure in this space is in terms of avoided loss and avoided costs. But private capital markets are motivated by profit seeking and taking a margin. And so they're very different logics coming into the same space. And so, as I say here on page 113, the only way to get over that boundary is to make adaptation more investable. And so this is where a lot of the global conversation is going at the moment in terms of blended finance, which is combining private and public finance and using public finance in a discrete and strategic way to reduce some of the risks to private finance and also potentially create revenue where revenue doesn't exist. So therefore, to make adaptation projects investable in a way that they may not be able to stand on their own two legs currently, but they could if public finance plays a sort of first loss role in that. And so there is this emerging conversation as to whether that can be a way to unlock funding in the future. Another option is to impose sort of user pays mechanisms so that people who are using infrastructure are paying for the use of that. And that can be done in the beneficiary pays approach where you're identifying beneficiaries. There's even some quite subtle ways where infrastructure might have a dual use. So there's a classic example in the Netherlands where some coastal infrastructure is also designed to be a car park. And so it's actually car parking that creates a revenue flow that goes back into paying for that infrastructure. I should say that's a one-off case. Most of the Netherlands gets their flood infrastructure through taxation. So it is an interesting example, but it's not necessarily the scalable example for all of their flood protection needs. But there are possibilities here as well. And, Zealandia is an interesting example in Wellington where people are now paying to enter what was originally part of the water supply there. And there's potentially kind of site-specific examples where you could take a user pays approach by turning river remediation actually into a biodiversity hotspot that people want to pay to go to visit. So there is sort of clever ways you might be able to tease that out. Again, there's a question as to whether that's scalable, whether these are quite site-specific sorts of solutions. And then the third thing I'd just mention quickly is the potential for adaptation technology, sometimes called AdapTech. There's new technologies emerging about water efficient management solutions, precision agriculture, smart water meters, removable flood defenses, and then the use of AI for weather prediction and prediction of events and so on, hydrological forecasting systems. These are startups and ideas that could become scalable in and of their own right and kind of therefore are responsive to the needs of private equity. And, Waikato is in an interesting position with its own innovation park and universities and so on. So it is worth considering the sort of growth opportunities as well, and directing technology towards solutions for these sorts of challenges, and therefore promoting growth and productivity in the region as a provider of these sorts of solutions, especially if those solutions can be applied elsewhere through the country for communities, and indeed the world for communities who are facing similar challenges.
Yeah, I am aware of a piece of work that the council's currently doing with partners in Holland, actually on some of that forecasting and stuff like that. So there's all sorts of things, and I've seen some amazing stuff done with coastal inundation around the world. Where you actually build a barrier, but it's totally usable for other opportunities where, as you say, you can actually get revenue from it in that space.
Indeed, and I think if there's forethought in the planning of these, then I think those opportunities can be identified and built into the project.
That's right. Yeah.
Just to insert something there, Mr. Chair, because in fact that's a really good example. We're doing a little piece of work which Blair is assisting us with in Tairua in the Coromandel around some coastal protection works, and this protects about 150 houses and about 50 businesses, roughly. And it's from the flood model, from the inundation modelling, it's pretty clear, where the immediate beneficiaries lie. The thing is that protecting all of Tairua, protecting Tairua also protects the viability of the community. Right? So if we just take beneficiary pays, this is a difficult project. If we take a wider view, then it's much more fundable. One of the things that comes out of it is the interaction with the insurance companies. So once those coastal protection works are in place, then the insurance companies have a much more insurable proposition as far as those houses are concerned. It would make sense, therefore, to have a conversation with the insurance companies about providing insurance for that community as a whole within the protected area. And so what it would do is give certainty to the insurance companies, which should be reflected back in lower premiums and greater certainties for homeowners. Right? Now, in those circumstances, though, it's a bit difficult to see 150 random homeowners in Tairua having the negotiation expertise or even the right thinking approach to get something together with the insurance sector. Right? It's a bit of a big ask. So this is exactly as David's saying, this is the role of council as advocator. It doesn't necessarily mean that council's not, suggesting stepping into the insurance market, but it has a way of bringing together some of these parties to say, great, well, we're doing this coastal protection works. That's all fine. We have the funding mechanism, but the way of bringing the insurance sector to the table is by making sure that the premiums are lower, that the certainty is greater, that that community is insured as a whole, which is a function that really only the council can engineer, as it were. But the funding and financing approach to this becomes as integral to the project as the actual engineering itself. So it's a very concrete example how these scenarios play out.
And I would encourage that wider view because both Ben and I have properties in Tairua, so just for transparency, of course. Did you have a question, Gary, or you're good?
No, just a comment, because you're talking about, private equity, they want profit, and I get that. But also they could quite often, bring a lower cost model to the thing. So yes, they can. So within between public and private side of it, it's not just one way they want profit. They can actually contribute another way. So, those are going to be really interesting discussions about, it's the old Ministry of Works convert to a private contractor to build a road argument, same thing. So yes, there'll be unders and overs with this thing, and I think there's going to be some really good conversations around that going forward. And I think, I just like the commentary on the paper as well while I'm talking. I just think it's a great piece of work, and we're going to enjoy going back over it and reading through it again because there's a lot to think about within there, but it's good.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, Ben.
Oh, just to follow up, it's more for Janine. Where do you see this document going to? I mean, I read it to begin with and thought we would actually get a model of the funding and financing. I see on page 110 is where we currently do rates, targeted rates, general rates, etc. How do you see this?
Well, let's wait, David, are you just about finished up?
Yeah. No,
Well, it's a question that he can answer as well. It's just,
No, because we're heading for next step, so, which is, I think, where you're leading your question. I was just making sure that the gentlemen are finished where they're at. And
I'd rather have discussion, I think. And so if anyone's got any questions, then let's just.
Okay, no, let's roll Ben.
Just looking, Kent's really keen to answer this one as well.
Just a thing to bear in mind when you're looking about funding and financing, because when we talk to the Crown about funding and financing, we agree a principle, say that 60-40 split. We get that embedded, it lasts through multiple governments, and pretty much council is then in charge of the projects and its prioritisation and how it approaches things and all that stuff, because the funding principle is there. When it comes to things like private equity or some of the more interesting instruments that David's highlighted, those tend to be project specific. So in other words, bear in mind that even if we go, hey, this would be a really good partnership with the insurance sector, or that would be a great nature-based thing that we could get out of philanthropics, it will be focused around that specific project and won't be a thing that we can apply in every circumstance for every scheme in the Waikato. So that's the only caveat to kind of bear in mind there.
And I'd warn that the more project specific and one-off a project is, the higher the transaction cost relative to the impacts it's going to drive. So there is a bit of a trade-off in terms of innovation. Like if you want to drive down the transaction costs, it's better to use something that you can scale and reproduce in multiple contexts rather than come up with a bespoke tailored solution.
Yeah. Sorry, where you go?
No, I was just going to come back to Ben's question, unless you want to carry that on. So I think, Ben, the way that this has been positioned for you is that this is proof of concept. So this sets the roadmap for how the work would actually then be tested, run, the models developed, and those types of things. So one of the key things that's in the agenda pack that we haven't touched on is the principles that will guide the way that the work rolls out next. We've been really clear through this that the work at the moment, we're not expecting a change in the funding policy for this LTP. There's still, you can see the mountain of work that's been undertaken to get to this point, and this is proof of concept. So it is using things like the Karakia Plains adaptation plan to really test it in practice. But that there's the set of principles that are included that it would be really good to get your feedback on today. The final step in this stage is a report back to you in the June council meeting with this information and with those principles set. That's in response to a KPI that Chris has for this year, which is around agreeing a set of principles. So, whether there's anything else the team want to add.
I guess the follow up then is this to me likes the philosophical approach in many ways. It's equity and those sorts of things in here. At what stage does the rubber hit the road when we get the financing actual policy? Is that a year from now? What are you thinking in terms of several years or?
We probably haven't got the detailed timeline for the next stage, other than knowing that the Karakia Plains adaptation plan will be the starting point to go, here's the concept, let's trial it here.
Okay, because
that will be the next stage, is actually to work out what that approach looks like.
And the Karakia bid for 60-40 permanent, where's that placed?
So there's sort of exactly as Janine says, there's a few things that are interlinked. So the first is that we're not anticipating any changes to this LTP, and Project Watershed is a complex thing that has been in place for quite some time. Even if we were to say, okay, here's the new plan, we would need to transition, and there would be grandparenting. It's not going to be a 5-minute job to simply go, okay, we're switching over your rating basis, in 10 minutes flat or anything like that, right? And obviously, as part of an LTP, it all needs to be consulted on with communities. There's a process to go through. So, but as that proceeds, the other things that are in play, the first is Te Uru Kahika. Remember, that goes up in July. Right? to
Right.
have conversations with both the current government but also the other parties in order to try and get that entrenched over the long term rather than being a year by year thing. Now that may or may not succeed, but that work is continuing through to Urukahika for those reasons. And in parallel, off the back of the Hauraki Plains work, what will come to the fore is that because of how we can now look at the costs and benefits, we can begin looking at specific schemes and trying out some ideas and going, okay, well, if this scheme looks like this, how's it currently funded? How would we think it could equitably be funded? What's the difference between those two things? So that'll be a more kind of a scheme specific or project specific first look, and through the fullness of time, I'm sure that some of those conversations will come back to this table to go, here would be the implications and testing out some of those ideas.
Well, except through the fullness of time, this table won't be here, and we may look by August at people having 3 unitary councils for the Waikato potentially. So are you looking at that change as you go through other models that, because clearly it's important this does get funded long term. Have you started to think about alternative structures as well?
This is kind of a Janine question from the point of view of where we sit as a project team. I mean, there's $1.22 billion worth of assets there and work that needs to get done every day. The actual form of what the organisational structure is that oversees that, irrespective, all of this is going to need to continue.
In my view, would be exactly that, irrespective of what the structure looks like. Actually understanding this and having this really well documented and thought through is critical for whatever any future entity might look like. Otherwise, where do they start from? Or what outcome will we achieve through that? So us owning this thinking at the moment, I think is critical.
Just on that, I commented to Greg, the slides he had in the earlier presentation were very good for setting out the actual issues there in real time too. So they're almost complementary to this.
Well, and so I think this report, once it's completed based on the feedback, will be an incredibly important document to actually articulate the challenge and the opportunity, but then actually having that applied to some real life scenarios in terms of what this looks like. We've just got to keep going.
And just as a plea, not even necessarily from the project team, but obviously the thing that makes the biggest difference in the shortest amount of time is to get the 60-40 split with the Crown, right? So in my experience, regional councillors are always very well connected politically and in Wellington. Your advocacy to help that process would be very much appreciated on behalf of not only your ratepayers, but in fact every ratepayer in the country.
The timing is impeccable because there's a regional sector meeting in Wellington starting Thursday, which we'll be at. Awesome. Look,
We're there because of LGNZ, are we?
Funny you should raise that, Ben. Great document. I must admit, I skipped to the back to see who we could charge and how before I actually went back to the front and actually did a little bit of reading. So no, excellently, and I thought it flowed really well. Didn't pick up as much grammatical errors as Noel did, so no chocolate fish in that space. But you'll note Janine, councillors, raised these principles, which is in your agenda pack. It's not in this document. So we are looking for feedback. It will be coming back to us in June, but you do need to be across them and bring any feedback back in a non-formal way, informal way, back through to Janine after discussion amongst ourselves. So just so you're aware as an action point out of this today would be good.
I hope Janine gets chocolate fish as well for all her changes.
Is that in the budget? Right, if there's nothing further or no further questions. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your presentation today and taking us through the steps and your literature. That is much appreciated. And we'll bring this workshop to an end with a karakia. Thanks, Jordan.
Unihe mai te uru tapanui, kia wātea, kia mama, te nako, te tinana, te hinanaro, He te ara takatu ke rā e ronga e whakare ake ke ronga ke teina humie hue tari ki.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you to those councillors online. Enjoy the rest of your day, and those in the room. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Warren.
Travel safely.